UE has a availability of 400 megahertz bandwidth, but all the time UE may not be required all the allocated bandwidth. It may be required, like let us take 40 megahertz or only 30 megahertz. That means only small part of the whole bandwidth. Maybe only this much only sufficient, or maybe some will just think like only 50 megahertz. Okay, so that means from one point to another point, we're taking small part of the whole bandwidth. This is bandwidth part. We can explain in more, we can describe in another technical way, like let us think like this is the resource grid. Of course, it's not wholly representing. Let us consider, yeah, this is a time domain, it's a frequency domain. Let's think like this is a resource grid and how we here resource blocks are configured for the corresponding carrier. Now we can see like now we are taking only small part of this one. Now here all the resource blocks are available and we are taking a couple of resource blocks, a group of resource blocks. So we can explain, we can consider like as a bandwidth part is nothing but a continuous group of PRBs. So that is what bandwidth part. And bandwidth part, it may have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. It can be configured up to 4 bandwidth parts, and each bandwidth part may not be in the same size. It's depend upon the network requirement, UE usage, and it depends. And every bandwidth part may or may not contain the SSP block. But the first starting bandwidth part, it must be having the SSP block, but for other bandwidth parts, it's an optional one. Now, bandwidth part, we got know what is it, but how it will be defined. It will be defined with some few parameters. Now we can say like if we want to understand bandwidth part, first we have to know starting position of the bandwidth part from the from where it is starting, and how many RBs it is allocating for that. We have to know these two, and we have to know that numerology also. Like if you know numerology, then we can understand what it will be subcarrier spacing and what it will be the CP type, whether it is extended or normal. Based on that, we can get to know the what kind of service it can be provided for the corresponding bandwidth part. Okay, now we have to know the why this bandwidth part is required morely in 5G. Yeah, we know 4G LTE also, but there won't be concept of bandwidth part. Here only Y means when compared to 4G, we have here a huge bandwidth, like we have a large bandwidth, either FR1 or FR2. Sub 6 we have 100 megahertz. If you go to millimeter wave, we have 400 megahertz. When compared to UE, it's a very large bandwidth. And if UE always can't use this much bandwidth, like it will be run out of its battery, and it may sound all UEs may not support this much bandwidth. So when if UE wants transfer less amount of data, it will be in requirement of small bandwidth part only. So let us say only 100 megahertz based on requirement. Then bandwidth part comes to the picture. Among of whole bandwidth, we will be taking only small part of it and we will be using it. And based on this requirement, one that's why we want. And there based on the limitation also. Like UE may not be supporting 100 megahertz or 200 megahertz. It will be supporting only limited part of it. So based on the UE limitation also, we will be considering its limitation. We will be taking required amount of bandwidth among the whole. And the main important one is when compared to 4G, in the 5G we have the data rate is more. When the data rate is more, it means the clock speed is more, and it has to be operating with it needs more battery. So we want to save the power. For saving the power, we want to operate in limited bandwidth by adjusting some parameters for operating limited bandwidth, and we have to provide good service. In that sense also, we are in need of bandwidth part. So in 3 ways mainly we need bandwidth part. First, based on the UE limitation and based on the UE requirement, and and for saving the UE battery power. Any doubts? If you have any doubts.
One question. So based upon the UE's capability, we have a different supported bandwidth part here, you mean? Is it correct? So normally we have 100 megahertz support for all categories of UE which supports 5G, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, means
No, so
all the UEs, yes.
yeah, so initially I think the initial one it may be the default one, Javid. But after once you move to connected mode, right, and once your data transfer starts, then basically what kind of data transfer you are doing will come into picture, and then accordingly network can configure, move you to a different.
Yeah, let's say network has configured 40 megahertz and 20 megahertz and 10 megahertz, 3 bandwidth parts. So UE may not support 40 megahertz. It can support some 20 and 10. Is it?
No, not that. Basically, it is doing. Let's say it is just doing a video call without any throughput.
Yes.
Okay? So why you want to be on a bigger BWP, right? In that case, you want to move to a smaller BWP. So based on the use case,
that is correct for that use case, but based upon the UE capability, the network assigned BWP based upon UE capability. The last sentence I didn't get to this one.
See, Javed, what I think is that there is a possibility that UE may support 2 BWPs, 4 BWPs like that. So that will be indicated to the network. So now if UE supports 2 BWPs only, the network can switch only between those 2 bandwidth parts.
Yes, so in Qualcomm, as of now, we see 3 BWPs, we do the testing, right? So is it 3 BWPs only supported as per now?
What I remember is that there is a capability for 2 or 4. Okay, I don't remember seeing capability for support of 3 BWPs, but while Shruti continues, I'll dig a bit on that and then get back in some time.
Okay. So that is the mean of capability that UE may support 2 BWPs or 4 BWPs. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now we just know what is bandwidth part. Now BWP. Now how BWP will be assigned and how many ways it will be allocated based on the requirement. Suppose let us think we have a whole carrier bandwidth, but UE may not be in the requirement of using whole, so it has a limited RF capability. So then we will be using the small portion of it among the whole. In that scenario, we will be using this type. And the next one is among the UE is in using some limited bandwidth, but suddenly it has to transfer such large amount of the data, some bursty traffic it has to go through it. Then it will be, by maintaining the same carrier, it will be enhancing its bandwidth from the previous one to the next one. So that means it is switching from bandwidth part 1 to bandwidth part 2. In that situation, we will be using this. And the next one, UE want to get the multiple services. So by using the whole carrier bandwidth, it will be using 1 or 2 bandwidth parts by assigning different numerologies. Means here subcarrier spacing will be different and here it will be different. If it will be bandwidth part 1 will be providing different kind of services and 2 will be providing different services. So by assigning 2 different numerologies, it will be getting different type of services, and in that scenario this kind of allocation will be preferred. And fourth one, like when we want to get one specific service and that we want to allocate that bandwidth in between the 2 bandwidth parts. Those 2 bandwidth parts may or may not be having the same numerology, but if you want to use specifically in between those 2, then we can be considering this kind of allocation. Now coming to the types of bandwidth parts. Till now we just know only like what is bandwidth part and why it is required. Now we are going to know how many types are available First, let us come from starting onwards. When UE switch on, it has to search for the cell and it has to select its file to camp on that cell. So whenever after you switch on, it has to search for the cell and it has to do after selecting, it has to do all the RAG procedure and everything. Now all the RAG procedure and all getting the system information, and it will be done in the initial bandwidth part. This is the first and the starting bandwidth part that will be allocated to the UE. This initial bandwidth part will be configured by it configured in SIB1 block. In SIB1 block, it will get all the information. From that onwards, it will be getting corresponding all the information from the network, and it will do the RAG procedure, and it will do the after that RRC connection will be established. Once RRC connection established, then UE comes to the first active bandwidth part. This bandwidth part will be activated after RRC connection only. And this is the first bandwidth part where UE can start sharing the data with the network. And this bandwidth part, UE can continue being in this bandwidth part, or it can be moved to some other bandwidth part also based on its requirement. Now, default bandwidth part. Default bandwidth part mainly designed and mainly used for as a backup purpose. Now let us think like UE is in one bandwidth part. It is actively sharing the data and actively communicating with the network. But suddenly, UE failed to decode some data and UE got interrupted due to bad channel conditions or whatever. Then what happens is the default timer will be there. If it will wait for some time, like to UE to respond, UE to decode. If timer was over, if it is unable to decode, then UE comes to the default bandwidth part. This default bandwidth part will be configured in the RRC configuration message itself. If it is not configured, then it will be considered as a initial bandwidth part as a default bandwidth part. It is mainly for the backup purpose, and we will be considering not only when UE failed to decode the data, when the UE is in idle for more than certain amount of the time, then also UE will be coming to the default bandwidth part.
Shruti, one question here.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Let's take we have 100 megahertz bandwidth and 41
Okay.
Ks. So initial bandwidth part will be our 100 megahertz, is it?
No, initial one, it won't be 100 megahertz. Initial bandwidth part, it will be very limited, I can say, because it has to do only the RAG procedure, right? It has to be
Yes. So
it has to be very limited. 100 megahertz, that is more than what it is required.
yes. So in SIB1 we will get limited number of PRPs for RAG procedure, is it?
Yes, means yes, exactly. I
So
can
our
show you
initial
the
bandwidth,
picture.
initial bandwidth part is not equal to our total 100
No,
megahertz.
it won't be the total. In future, in upcoming slides, I will show you the one real example. In the log, I can show you the one assigned initial bandwidth part, how much it is allocated by network to the UE.
Okay, fine.
Approximately, then you can get the idea like how much it is allocated initially.
Yeah, one example, if it is there in later
Yeah.
slides, it's fine. Regarding initial bandwidth part and active by BWP and default, how it is.
Yes, it is
Okay.
there. In
Okay,
upcoming slide, it will be there. I will show to you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Whatever we discussed, this picture represents in a bit more clarity. It's like when we let's think like our UE is power on and it has to camp on the cell. So first it will acquire all the system information and it will do the RAS procedure and it will be going to the connected mode. And until the connected mode, it will be in the initial bandwidth part. Once the device go into the connected mode, then it will go to the first active bandwidth part. First active bandwidth part, it will start to transfer the data with the network. it can be, if it wants, it can be in the same bandwidth, or if it based on the requirement, it can be switched to other bandwidth parts also. When it is in one bandwidth part, it correctly actively sharing the data. If it faces any issue, if it unable to due to any condition, then after certain time and after timer expire, it will come to the default bandwidth part. It will come to the default bandwidth part or initial bandwidth part based on the configuration. Yeah, I think someone asked me about this. Yeah, this is the one initial bandwidth part. There will be initial downlink bandwidth part and initial uplink bandwidth part. Here I am showing only initial downlink path that will be configured in the SIP1. Now look at, we can see this one. Means here if you see like subcarrier spacing was allocated 15 kHz and band location and bandwidth was 28,875. Maybe, yeah, by knowing this value, we can't get exact information. There will be like 38.2111 spec. From that, if corresponding to this value, if we enter that, there will be, we can get to know starting size, starting location and a number of RPs. I think if you enter this value, maybe you will be getting starting position as a 20 and maybe 30 RPs will be allocated, I guess. If we enter this value, we will get to know the starting location and the number of RPs. This is regarding initial downlink bandwidth part, and now this is after this first active bandwidth part, it will be configured in RRC setup. I think Javed.
Yes.
Hello.
Fine. Yeah, got it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, Javed. Yeah, here like this, it will be configured. And if you want to know exact information, you have to enter this value. You have to check this value in the spec. There you will get the number of RPs exactly that was allocated. I think in online also there is a corresponding calculator to get that. Where are there also? Yeah, I have the link also. After this presentation, I will forward that link to you. I will forward link in the group.
Fine.
Yeah, there we will get the information.
So Shruti, you said initial BWP is for Raj procedure and the default BWP is for Raj procedure and the initial BWP is for initial BWP is for Raj.
Yes, and the default bandwidth part, the default BWP is for the backup purpose. Like if UE fails to decode or UE is idle for so much time, then it will come to this one.
Okay, and then Raj procedure is initiated in the default BWP. After the idle, whatever you said, UE is in idle for some time, and then it has some data to be sent to the network. Then the Raj has to go, obviously, right, to send that, let us RRC resume or RRC connection request or RRC setup request. That will happen on the default BWP or the initial BWP.
Yeah, that will be happened in it will come to the default bandwidth part. Now, now if you again want to share the data, then again it has to send all the RAS procedure. Then it will go to the initial bandwidth part.
Okay, default BWP is a UE specific BWP. In case it is not configured, okay. It will be, so initial BWP also can be the default BWP. Okay.
Yes.
And then in order to move from initial BWP to the first active BWP, will there be a communication from network to the UE, or UE will, after successful reception of RRC connection setup, let us say, then UE will start sending setup complete and the subsequent messages or data transfer on the active BWP?
Yeah, there
without
will be
any communication?
No, first UE will send the RRC connection request in the hello.
Yeah, you are audible. Go ahead.
Yes, in the RRC connection request you will be sent. Then the RRC setup message itself, network will be configured this first active BWP and it will send to the UE.
Right. So
yes.
after
that means the connection establishment. The connection establishment and first active bandwidth part will get the both will be done at the same time.
on the initial BWP itself.
Yes.
After we get setup message, then setup complete and the subsequent will UE automatically move to the first active BWP, or UE will stay on initial BWP only till further communication from the network? That's what I'm asking.
Okay. Once UE get the RRC setup message, from the next moment onwards, UE will switch to the first active bandwidth part.
Okay.
Yes.
So all the subsequent messages like setup complete and maybe some security establishment related procedures also will happen on the first active.
Yes, those will be done in the first active bandwidth part only. Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
One doubt, Shruti. Is it happening in first active BWP after RRC connection setup? Because I have a confusion, like if we were in the initial BWP only and reconfiguration we got, and based upon RRC based BWP switch, or we have a DCI based BWP switch, then it moved to active BWP.
Yes. Like, sorry, can you represent that again? Like,
So I mean, attach process will be completed in initial BWP, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, the RAS process will be completed in initial BWP only.
Even in even attach process also till RRC connection reconfiguration complete.
I don't think so. As per the log I observed, I am just observing like from the RRC connection establishment or from RRC reconfiguration onwards, the active bandwidth part is activated.
Okay, fine. I will check once again.
We can check the logs again.
Yeah.
I think, Shruti, the question is about whether it is after setup or after reconfiguration. That's it, which can be checked later.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, after setup itself, it will be activated.
I think if the SI is configured in the setup, then it gets activated after setup. If not, after reconfiguration.
Yes.
Yeah, it looks like that. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Okay.
So when we say two BWPs are supported, my question is that includes the initial BWP and the first active BWP. So these we are considering it as two, right? We are not really. Okay.
Yeah, we won't be ignoring this initial BWP.
Initial one. Okay. And then if by any chance it supports more than two, do we call it as second BWP, third BWP like that, or is there some other terminology for?
No, okay. Means initial is, let us think like we have a configured two BWPs, then we won't be including the initial BWP. We will be considering only the active BWPs. Okay, let us think like in uplink we have a two BWPs are configured. Then that means two BWPs are for uplink plus initial BWP. Totally 3 BWPs.
Yeah, that's what. Okay, so initial BWP shall not be counted when we talk 2 BWPs or 4 BWPs, is it?
Yes.
Yes, brother. So totally initial plus 4 is what can be done.
Okay.
Actually, it is like even initial bandwidth part is also considered if dedicated configuration is present in initial bandwidth part. So it can still have.
Yeah, that can.
Yeah, but common configuration and dedicated configuration still are possible with initial BWP. If dedicated configuration is present in initial bandwidth part, it will be considered as one. Like it is also considered towards whatever we are reporting as 2. Let's say if it is not having dedicated configuration, then it is not considered. So basically the 2 or 4 that we are advertising is for dedicated configurations.
Got it.
Yes.
So what you are saying is the initial BWP can be sending either common config or dedicated config as well.
It can configure both actually. Common and dedicated, but dedicated is not mandate. So if it is configuring dedicated also, then it is counted towards that number.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, on a high level, like UE can be configured. Network can configure like up to 4 bandwidth parts, and 4 BWPs for uplink and 4 BWPs for downlink. But out of 4, only 1 BWP only active at a time for uplink and for the downlink. Yeah, the initial BWP, yes, they said like initial BWP will be configured by S1 and it will be generally it will be shared with it will have the common config related info. That means mainly it will have the specific information. So we won't be considering this as a part of this one. So it will be mostly having the common configuration information and mainly example like any kind of batch related information. And another is like dedicated configuration. This kind of dedicated configuration is mostly will be UE specific, and this UE specific related information, it will be shared and it will be configured only in the active bandwidth part. As I told, only one bandwidth BWP will be active at a time. In that active bandwidth part only, this dedicated configuration will be shared. Suppose like either PDSH or PUSSH information like that. Suppose all the downlink schedule information, means the downlink configuration channel information will be received only in the downlink bandwidth part, only in the active downlink bandwidth part. And all the uplink shared information, uplink configuration information will be sent only in the active uplink bandwidth part. Out of all bandwidth parts, only UE actives only one bandwidth part and it will communicate through that only. But UE will communicate only that. There can be small exception. Sometimes you can use the measurement gaps to perform the measurements outside active bandwidth part. Mostly like maybe to perform the handovers when it want to measure the neighbor cell power and it has to do measurements on neighbor cell to hand over the call. In that situations, you can use measurement gap and perform the measurements. And that's what. Like in this way, bandwidth part will be configured. Now, bandwidth part switching. Like yes, we already discussed. Like there are multiple bandwidth parts like initial bandwidth part and first active bandwidth part and default bandwidth part and some additional configured bandwidth parts also. Based on the different stages and requirement, UE will switch from one to another. So how it will switch? Now we will going to see like there are different types of switching like RRC based and DCI based and timer based. A kind of four procedures will be there, and now we are going to see RRC based BWP switch. And in RRC based, it has a very long switching latency, so that's why we won't be preferring this very highly busty traffic cases. So we'll be preferring this only for semi-static traffic cases only. This bandwidth part switch, this can be configured through the RRC reconfiguration message. In the RRC reconfiguration, it will be mentioning like what is the location and what is the bandwidth. To wherever we need to switch, it will give the details. It will configure in the RRC configuration message in the RRC reconfiguration packet. From that information, our UE will switch to the corresponding bandwidth. And here. If the RRC allocation is changing very rapidly, then this kind of switching may not be preferred. If it's not changing very rapidly, then this switching can be used and it can be possible without losing any data. Here we can see initially our UE is in this is in bandwidth part UE has, and after certain amount of time through RRC reconfiguration, network configured another bandwidth part with this information. This is only downlink bandwidth part. Now uplink bandwidth part also, it will be separate. It has a separate active bandwidth part. That is through RRC reconfiguration message. And now there is another type with the DCI based bandwidth part switch. Once you use an active bandwidth part, based on the UE requirement, it can switch to another another bandwidth part. Maybe when it suddenly want to send a very high amount of data, then it need in large amount of bandwidth, then it will switch to another bandwidth. In that situations, mostly it prefers the DCI based, because the main reason is it has very low switching latency. And that's why it's mostly we use this bandwidth part, this BWP switching. And there are two formats, like if it is DCI 01 we use for uplink ranks, and DCI 1,1 format we will use for downlink scheduling and the downlink bandwidth part. If we see the
One question. So regarding this BWP switching latency, do we have any particular specification, or what is the switching delay between one BWP to other BWP in terms of slots or in microsecond? In RRC based and DCI based, do we have any tip?
So, Javid, RRC based, we have 29 milliseconds for NSA test case and 19 milliseconds for SA. Yeah.
Okay.
So, due to this delay, right, if you consider compared to DCI, so DCI based will be typically 4-5 milliseconds is what we see. Based on your KGO value, it will have to switch and then transmit on the given new BWP. So that will be typically 5 to 6 milliseconds. So compared to RRC based, definitely DCI based is more suitable.
Okay.
So GCF requirement is 29 milliseconds for NSA and 19 milliseconds for SA.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, okay.
One question I also have, how UE will communicate to the network that BWP needs to be switched? Is it a network driven process, or UE also has some say, or UE can ask in one way or the other to the network?
It is the network driven process.
Because you said that if there is large amount of data, then it will be switched to other BWP. You are mainly talking from the downlink perspective. If network wants to send more data, it may switch from one BWP to the other one.
Yes. Mostly it will be network will be more.
Yeah, Badwa, so even for uplink, right? UE will be continuously sending the BSR, which network can check and then estimate how much data is there with the UE uplink buffer. And based on that, it can decide to move it to a smaller BWP or bigger BWP.
Okay, but that is uncertain. Just based upon some criteria, it is up to the network to decide.
Correct. And basically, it depends on what kind of use cases you are running. If you really need low bandwidth, then a network can decide to move to a lower bandwidth.
Okay, we can see it like this is just when the UE is in the initial bandwidth part. If for every, initial bandwidth part always bandwidth part ID will be 0 only. Now initial bandwidth part here it is a number of RPs are allocated 47. I think someone asked how many frequencies allocating. Like here it will be allocated 47. It is a few less. If you say SSB packet, it will be 20 RPs, I guess. It will be double than SSB. Just for the initial, for all the RAS procedure and for the initial camping time, for the camping processes, this bandwidth is allocated. But after certain time, UE will be in first active bandwidth part. Here, if you can see it, the uplink, the RPs are assigned 1590. And on the downlink, as you can see, from the offset is 0. That means it is starting from 0, starting from initial, and 2438 RPs are allocated. After that, you will be switching to the another one. Now he can see here clearly the offset is 2, but the size it is maintaining constantly. Like again 2438 RPs are allocated, and uplink also it moved to another bandwidth part, and here RPs are 2438. Means from it is in one bandwidth part, here it is here the another bandwidth part is assigned here. Now let's go to the another bandwidth part switch. Like in the previous one, when you able to decode the DCI information, DCI packet, whatever it mentioned, then only it can able to switch to that bandwidth part. But let us think like you failed to decode that DCI information. Maybe reason can be another either bad channel condition or whatever. If you fail to decode the DCI information, then it won't be getting where to switch and which bandwidth, which RB it has to choose to transmit the data. Then at that time, the timer will get activated. The timer will be like bandwidth part inactivity timer. This will be configured in the reconfiguration message itself, like in the first active bandwidth part itself, it will be configured. Then UE wait certain amount of the time, whatever configured. If UE is still unable to decode the information, then it will move to the default bandwidth part. That is the one condition. And the another one is or when the UE is in idle state and means UE is not transferring actively communicating with the network, UE is in idle state, then also inactivity timer will be activated, and after a certain amount of time it will be again switching to the default bandwidth part. Let us think like a default bandwidth part is not configured at all. Then if it is not configured, then it will switch to the initial bandwidth part. Now you can see here default downlink bandwidth part, it is ID is 0, means maybe bandwidth part ID is 0 will be initial bandwidth part only. So it will be switching to the initial bandwidth part. Now let's go to the another kind of switching like RACH based. Now let us think like UE is in one active bandwidth part, and but UE has to start the RACH procedure. But that wherever the UE is there in the current active bandwidth part, their SSB block is not there. If SSB block is not there, or it can't be getting all the required information for the RACH procedure. Then UE needs to trigger, like UE needs to trigger that it has to do the RACH. Then UE moves to from the current active band BWP to the initial BWP. This kind of switching we call like a RACH based BWP switching. Yeah, any questions?
Okay, how do we do this RACH based BWP switch? I mean, in Topcat, how we trigger this? Is it possible?
You mean like in the given setup?
Yes.
Yeah, so on the setup, I don't think we have any test case for this one in GCF. So in GCF, we only have two based on, one is RC based and second is
DCI
based. Those are the two most deployed scenarios. These two are, I think, not so much deployed. So we don't have any scenario, at least on GCF area. I am not sure about lab.
But if RACH configuration is not present in this current active ELBWP, then
yes,
let us say UE exhausts multiple SR scheduling requests or whatever, and then it has to fall back to RACH procedure. Then
there should be some timer.
Yeah, the timer is configured based upon that L2 SR periodicity, right?
Okay.
So after that is done, then UE, because in this BWP we don't have RACH resources configured, and then I have to move back to our initial BWP, because there is a guarantee that I can do a RACH.
Okay. And this timer based BWP switch, for every DCI failed to decode, we will start this timer, inactivity timer. So let us say we have one DCI, DCI failed. So do we start every time whenever there is a failure, this timer?
Not every time failure, like, yeah.
There is some number of subframes or slots failed, then only we start.
That condition, I think we will have to check.
Myself, I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I mean, this implementation we need to check. Like,
yeah, correct. We don't do generally this. Yes.
Yeah,
okay,
but
fine.
I don't think it should start. It should start even with the first failed DCI. then it will be kind of continuously running, right? I mean, if the UE is in poor channel condition, then essentially it is always running in that case.
Yes, I think there should be some slot numbers.
Yeah, some defensive mechanism should be there. To understand if UE is really in a bad situation and it has to really move to default BWP.
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
Yeah, any more questions?
Okay, I think thanks Shruti for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
If there is no question, then maybe we can close the call. Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you for attending.